Today we'll be focusing on a film made by three individuals who, at the peak of their careers, lost touch with reality and caused the film's already hefty budget to skyrocket. This is a very common problem among successful people, and Hollywood is a prime example. Many celebrities' careers have been ruined due to their inflated egos. Gore Verbinski became one of Hollywood's most famous directors when the first three Pirates of the Caribbean films were released. The director had all doors open to him, with studios ready to allocate hundreds of millions of dollars for his projects. The director's next project after Pirates of the Caribbean was the animated film Rango. Although the $135 million film wasn't a huge box office hit, Rango received high praise from critics and audiences, and predictably won the Academy Award for Best Animated Feature at the end of the year. Soon after, though, The Lone Ranger happened. At the beginning of the 2000s, the project was developed by Sony Pictures. Initially, The Lone Ranger was to be directed by Jonathan Mostow, known for directing Terminator 3 and Breakdown. Tonto was supposed to be a woman, and the movie was meant to have a similar tone to The Mask of Zorro. Sony allocated $70 million for the project. However, the studio was not satisfied with the script by David and Janet Peoples, who also worked on Terry Gilliam's 12 Monkeys. They hired Leda Kalogridis to rewrite it, but the result did not meet Sony's expectations, and they abandoned the film. Perhaps the project would have remained untouched to this day, but after finishing work on Rango, Gore Verbinski remembered that he really liked the TV series The Lone Ranger as a child. The project had 5 seasons and ran from 1949 to 1956. Having learned about the famous director's desire to make a similar feature film, Walt Disney Pictures quickly acquired the Lone Ranger rights and began production. Shortly after, the project was joined by Johnny Depp and producer Jerry Bruckheimer, with whom Verbinski had a great working relationship on Pirates of the Caribbean. The studio didn't even bother to look at the original $70 million script and threw it away, as they found $70 million to be a ridiculous amount of money for such influential gentlemen. It's actually quite funny that they decided to completely abandon the Mask of Zorro-like script. The first Pirates of the Caribbean was originally conceived as a kind of fusion of The Mask of Zorro and The Mummy. Gore Verbinski and Jerry Bruckheimer hoped that new screenwriters Terry Rossio and Ted Elliott would write something similar, but on a larger scale. After all, it was Rossio and Elliott who brought Pirates of the Caribbean to Verbinski and Bruckheimer in 2003, and they were also the ones in charge of The Mask of Zorro in 1998. With no one to hold them back, the writers turned The Lone Ranger into a thrilling blockbuster with an estimated budget of $250 to $270 million. This is when Disney decided to step in. Such expenses were not part of the film company's plan, so they asked the filmmakers to cut back on their spending. They rewrote the script, removing most of the fantasy elements, such as werewolf attacks, zombie apocalypse, and so on. Because it was impossible to cut the script any further, Gore Verbinski, Jerry Bruckheimer, Johnny Depp, and Armie Hammer, who also joined the cast, agreed to significant pay cuts. For example, Johnny Depp, who initially expected $25 million for playing Tonto, settled for $20 million, his usual fee at the time. This was assumed to keep the film within the $170 to $175 million budget. However, there were still significant cost overruns. For instance, Gore Verbinski didn't like any of the Wild West towns the studio suggested for filming. He thought none of them were real enough. Therefore, the film crew had to build a completely new town in the middle of a desert. Then Verbinski decided that CGI trains would be too unrealistic, so the engineers had to construct real ones, along with a miles-long railroad track. It is worth noting that what they built were not just models but full-size 19th century trains. All this pushed The Lone Ranger's already impressive budget to $220 million, making it one of the most expensive movies of 2013. The filming process didn't go very smoothly. Besides, journalists quickly learned of the enormous production costs, which drew a lot of media attention to The Lone Ranger. To top it off, journalists began actively comparing The Lone Ranger to 2012's John Carter, the biggest failure in Disney's history. This is what Johnny Depp, Jerry Bruckheimer, Gore Verbinski, and Armie Hammer were most upset about when the film hit theaters. They believed that journalists created a negative atmosphere around the film even before it was released. And when the film finally came out, most critics focused on its huge budget and production difficulties, rather than its quality. In one of his interviews, Johnny Depp stated that most of the critics' reviews for The Lone Ranger were written months before its theatrical release. He said that many critics were repeating the same statements they had made about John Carter. It was as if they were too lazy to come up with something new. Be that as it may, despite a $215 million budget, the movie only made $260 million at the box office. Various insiders say Disney lost $100 to $150 million on The Lone Ranger. Disney was so enraged by the film's exorbitant budget that they promptly terminated their multi-year contract with producer Jerry Bruckheimer. The next time they met was to work on the next Pirates of the Caribbean film, for which the producer owns some of the rights. Apart from this, Bruckheimer's career took a sharp decline. He put his efforts into different TV series of varying quality and films, like Gemini Man. Although it's popular these days to point fingers at the Mouse House, it is hard to do so in this situation. A couple of years before The Lone Ranger, Prince of Persia and The Sorcerer's Apprentice had disappointing box office performances as well. Bruckheimer was responsible for both films, and he couldn't keep either within the planned budgets. Adding to that, the fourth Pirates movie underperformed at the box office and received mixed reviews from the media and audiences. Right now, Jerry is doing what all people who have lost their former glory do. He is returning to his old hits. And based on box office receipts, he is doing a great job. The third Bad Boys film did very well at the box office. Bruckheimer, who has never taken negative reviews from critics seriously, is still confident that time will bring clarity. He believes The Lone Ranger will eventually be considered a classic, much like Blade Runner. The failure of The Lone Ranger also impacted Johnny Depp's career. The only movie for which he received a fee comparable to The Lone Ranger was Transcendence, where he got a role while still working on the Western. The one who suffered the most was Gore Verbinski. The director, who once had numerous script offers and studios lining up to work with him, started having trouble finding work after the movie's disastrous failure. 4 years after The Lone Ranger, he took on the low-budget thriller A Cure for Wellness. However, the director's luck ran out completely, and the $40 million film grossed only $26 million in theaters. Rumors suggest that Gore Verbinski might direct the next Pirates of the Caribbean movie, possibly as a reboot or spin-off, with a woman as the lead. However, there were no official statements on the matter. In a meeting with journalists in 2014, the head of Disney confessed that selling TV rights and releasing The Lone Ranger in media didn't help the studio mitigate losses from its failure.